In February 1959, in the far north of Soviet Russia, searchers on a frozen mountainside found a tent. It was half buried in snow, pitched with textbook precision, and empty. It had been slashed open from the inside. Below it, 9 sets of footprints walked down into the darkness. Some in socks. Some barefoot. That night, it was around 30 degrees below zero. The 9 people who left those footprints were all found in the weeks that followed, and what was found has kept scientists, prosecutors, and detectives arguing for 67 years. Fatal injuries that no fall could explain, on bodies with barely a bruise on the outside. Clothing that set a radiation detector clicking. And a criminal case that ended with 9 dead young people and a cause of death that reads like a confession of defeat, an unknown compelling force. This is the Dyatlov Pass incident, perhaps the most documented unsolved event of the 20th century. Tonight we walk through it hour by hour, the diaries, the photographs, the autopsy tables, and the theories, including the one published in a Nature journal in 2021 that finally cracked part of this mystery open. By the end, you will know exactly what science has solved, and the one detail it still cannot touch. The mountain where it happened has a name in the language of the local Mansi people. Kholat Syakhl. The Dead Mountain. January 1959. Sverdlovsk, today's Ekaterinburg, a closed Soviet industrial city in the Ural Mountains. At the Ural Polytechnic Institute, 10 young people are packing for the trip of their lives, a 300-kilometer ski trek through the wilderness of the northern Urals, in the dead of winter, to a remote peak called Otorten. Grade 3, the highest difficulty category that existed. If they made it, every one of them would qualify as a master-level trekker. They were not reckless kids. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, 23, was a radio engineering student who built his own equipment, stoves, radios, the tent itself, 2 tents sewn into one. Zina Kolmogorova, 22, was the heart of the group. Half the expedition was quietly in love with her. Luda Dubinina, 20, kept the camera and the group's accounts. Around them, Rustam Slobodin, Yuri Doroshenko, Yuri Krivonischenko, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, engineers and engineering students, all seasoned, all fit, all friends. And then there is the 10th member, the one nobody has ever quite explained. Semyon Zolotaryov, 38 years old. A decorated combat veteran of the Second World War, tattooed, gold-toothed, a professional trekking instructor who joined the group only days before departure, and introduced himself under a different first name, Sasha. He said he needed one more grade 3 route for a certification. The students barely knew him. Keep your eye on Semyon Zolotaryov. At the end of this story, he will be the strangest detail of all. On January the 23rd, they boarded the night train north, singing to a mandolin. We know, almost hour by hour, how happy they were, because they wrote it all down. The group kept shared diaries, and the film from their cameras survived. 10 young faces, grinning through frost. 10 got on that train. Only 9 would climb the mountain. Their route took them to the edge of the inhabited world. The mining town of Ivdel. Then a logging outpost called Vizhay, the last place with a telephone. Then an abandoned geologist settlement, reachable only by ski. Beyond that, nothing but taiga, frozen rivers, and the low, wind-scoured domes of the northern Urals. This was the corridor they skied into. At the abandoned settlement, the 11th hour twist that decides who lives. Yuri Yudin, the 10th hiker, wakes with crippling pain in his back and leg. Sciatica. He cannot ski 300 kilometers. On January the 28th, he hugs his friends, hands over his warm things, and turns back. Zina walks him to the edge of the settlement. It is the luckiest back pain in recorded history, and Yuri Yudin will spend the next 54 years asking why it was him. The 9 ski on, up the frozen Lozva River, then its tributary the Auspiya, hauling sledged supplies through waist-deep powder. The diaries stay cheerful, campfire songs, arguments about love and science, Thibault's jokes, temperatures sinking through -20. They pass sacred marks of the Mansi, the indigenous hunters of these forests, carved into cedar bark. Remember the Mansi. Within weeks, investigators will try to blame them for everything. On January the 31st, they reach the tree line below the high passes, and the mountains show their teeth. A wall of wind meets them at the edge of the forest. Dyatlov writes that it feels like the air blast of an airplane taking off. They retreat, camp, and in the morning build a labaz, a raised cache of food and spare gear for the return leg. Then, on the afternoon of February the 1st, they climb toward the pass with lightened packs. They will never come back for the cache. What happens next puzzles hikers to this day. Late on February the 1st, in worsening weather and failing light, the group does not drop back down into the shelter of the trees. Instead, they stop on the open eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl, the dead mountain, and pitch their tent right there, on a bare incline, anchored with skis and poles, exposed to whatever the sky decides to do. A defensible choice, by an ambitious leader who did not want to lose altitude. It was also the last decision Igor Dyatlov would ever make. We know the hour, because the camera survived. Frame after frame from that final afternoon, figures leaning into driving snow, the flat white light of a dying day, and the last exposures, the group digging a platform for the tent into the slope, around 5 in the evening. Ordinary, disciplined mountaineering. 9 competent people doing everything right. They had no idea they were photographing their own final hours. Inside the tent that evening, they did something that breaks your heart in hindsight. They made a newspaper. A single handwritten sheet, a joke bulletin they titled The Evening O Torton, number 1, dated February the 1st, mocking each other's snoring, debating whether love exists. One headline, written in fun, reads almost unbearably now, from now on, we know that snowmen exist. They ate a cold supper, the stove stayed packed, took off their boots, hung up their outer layers, and settled in for the night, 9 people shoulder to shoulder for warmth. Outside, the wind worked the slope above them. And at some point in the next few hours, something made all 9 of them cut their way out through the walls of their own tent and walk, half-dressed and shoeless, into a night that could kill a fully equipped man in hours. Whatever it was, it convinced every single one of them. And it convinced them fast. Dyatlov had promised a telegram from Vizhay by around February the 12th. The date came. Nothing. At first, no one worried, winter routes run late, and the institute assumed the delay. But the families would not be brushed off, and by February the 20th, the search began, volunteer students, then soldiers, then police, then aircraft, one of the largest search operations the region had ever seen, sweeping a wilderness the size of a small country. They searched by ski, by plane, by helicopter, with Mansi hunters reading the forest. On February the 25th, a search group led by a student named Boris Slobtsov cut across an old ski track in the Auspiya Valley. They followed it up, toward the pass between Kholat Syakhl and the neighboring heights. The next morning, on the bare eastern slope, one of them spotted a dark shape against the snow. It was the tent, exactly where the photographs said it would be. Skis still planted upright at the entrance. The ridge still partly standing. Snow drifted over the downhill wall. The entrance was buttoned shut from the inside. And when the searchers dug it out, they found a scene frozen in the middle of an ordinary evening, 9 backpacks, 9 pairs of boots, jackets, blankets, an axe, cameras, diaries, money, bread and a slab of bacon laid out, and a flashlight sitting on top of the tent roof, left switched on. Then they saw the walls. The canvas had been sliced open, long vertical cuts, big enough for a person. The first assumption was obvious: someone attacked the tent from outside. But when a forensic seamstress examined the fabric weeks later, the fibers told the opposite story. Every major cut had been made from the inside. 9 experienced hikers had destroyed their only shelter, to get out of it faster than the entrance would allow. Below the tent, the snow preserved the next chapter. 8, perhaps 9 sets of footprints, starting a few meters downhill, in socks, in felt liners, one in a single boot. And here is the detail that investigators kept returning to: the tracks were not the chaos of a stampede. They ran in a loose, single-file line, evenly spaced. Whatever drove them out, the group left together, walking, not scattering. The prints ran downhill toward the forest and faded under fresh snow after 500 meters. Everything about the scene was inside out. Hikers die reaching for shelter, these 9 had abandoned it. Cold kills the unprepared, these were 9 of the best trained trekkers in the region, and their boots, coats and axes stayed in the tent. The tracks led down, 1.5 kilometers, to the edge of the forest. To a tall old cedar tree. And under that cedar, on February the 27th, the searchers found the first 2. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko lay by the remains of a small fire, under the cedar, in the snow. Both were in their underwear. Neither wore shoes. Their hands were burned, and shreds of their skin were found on the cedar's bark. Above them, the tree itself testified, branches snapped off up to 5 meters high, a height you only reach by climbing, in the dark, at 30 below, with bare and freezing hands. Why climb a tree while freezing to death? From 5 meters up, through the trees, you can see one thing: the slope where the tent stood. A lookout post. And the fire tells its own desperate arithmetic: it burned perhaps an hour and a half, small, starving, while all around, the forest stood full of deadwood. The 2 Yuris fed it what their frozen hands could break, watched the mountain, and went out with their fire. And someone survived them, because someone cut the clothes from their bodies after they died. That someone was walking uphill. Between the cedar and the tent, spaced out along the line of retreat, the searchers found 3 more. Igor Dyatlov, 300 meters up, on his back, fists clenched, facing the tent. Rustam Slobodin further on, with a crack in his skull that he could have walked with, but that would have been dimming his mind as the cold closed in. And Zina Kolmogorova, the heart of the group, 630 meters up the slope, closer to the tent than anyone. They were not fleeing. They died climbing back. 5 bodies. The autopsies came back with a consistent answer: hypothermia. Freezing. Slobodin's skull fracture was noted, survivable, the examiner judged. So the story seemed to write itself: something panicked them out of the tent, the cold did the rest. A tragedy, not a mystery. Except for the question no one could close: what panics 9 elite trekkers so completely that they slash through their own tent, and then walk away from it calmly, in formation? And there was a bigger problem. 4 hikers were still missing: Luda Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, and the outsider, Semyon Zolotaryov. Through March, through April, the searchers probed the snowfields with steel rods, walked grids, brought dogs. Nothing. The mountain had taken 4 people and simply refused to give them back. The prosecutors kept the case open and waited for the spring melt. On May the 4th, 75 meters from the cedar, in the ravine of a small stream, a Mansi searcher's probe brought up a piece of flesh-colored cloth from under the snow. They started digging. For meters down, for meters, they broke into the last chapter of the story. And everything the case thought it knew ended in that hole. First they found the den. A floor of cut fir branches, laid with care on the streambed under the snow, and on it, pieces of clothing. Trousers. Half a sweater. Cut, not torn, the clothes of the dead men at the Cedar, sliced off and carried here as insulation. Someone in this group had kept thinking, kept working, kept surviving, building shelter in the dark while their friends froze on the slope above. The 4 bodies lay in and beside the stream, meters from the den. Luda Dubinina, kneeling against the rock wall of the ravine. Alexander Kolevatov and Semyon Zolotaryov together, as if sharing warmth to the end. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles nearby. They were the best dressed of the 9, layered in their own clothes and the clothes of their dead friends. These 4 had come closest to surviving the night. And these 4 were the reason the case file would never close quietly. The autopsies, conducted by Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, read like a contradiction in terms. Thibault-Brignoles, a massive, fatal fracture of the skull. Dubinina and Zolotaryov, chests crushed, ribs broken in multiple places, on both sides. The doctor's comparison became the most quoted sentence in the file: injuries like a car crash, a force beyond what any human blow could deliver. And yet, on the outside, no wounds to match. No bruising where the bones had shattered. As if the force that broke them had pressed, evenly, like a great weight, not struck. Then the detail that launched 1,000 theories. Luda Dubinina's tongue and eyes were missing. Zolotaryov's eyes as well. In 1959, the file recorded it without comment, and the internet has screamed about it ever since. Modern forensics is quieter. The 4 lay for 3 months in a snow-fed running stream, and moving water and scavengers take soft tissue first. It is a natural process, documented in countless alpine recoveries. It is almost certainly not a clue. But try telling that to anyone reading the file at midnight. One more image from the ravine, and it is the one this channel cannot let go of. Semyon Zolotaryov, the decorated war veteran who joined 9 students at the last minute under a half-false name, was found with a camera around his neck. And in his hands, by several accounts from the recovery, a notebook and a pencil. As if, in the final minutes, the old soldier had tried to write down what he was looking at. The notebook, when it reached the investigators, was blank. The film in the camera was ruined by water. Whatever Semyon Zolotaryov wanted to record, the mountain kept. And then the case took its strangest documented turn. The investigators ordered a radiological examination of the victim's clothing, an extraordinary step in 1959, and the file never explains who requested it or why. The results: several items of clothing from the Ravine 4 carried significant traces of beta radiation. Contamination, on the sweaters and trousers of dead students, on a mountainside 300 kilometers from anywhere. This is not legend. It is page after page of the criminal file. This is that file. On May the 28th, 1959, 3 weeks after the ravine, lead investigator Lev Ivanov signed the resolution closing the case. The conclusion, in the file's own words: the hikers died because of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. No crime. No named cause. Case closed, files sent to the archive, parts of them classified, and the area quietly restricted to amateur expeditions for the next 3 years. 9 dead, and the state's final answer was, in effect, the mountain did it. There is a footnote the Soviet Union never printed. During the search weeks, multiple witnesses, other trekking groups, soldiers, meteorologists, reported glowing orange spheres drifting across the northern sky. Decades later, those dates would line up neatly with early UR-7 intercontinental rocket tests. But in 1959 nobody told the searchers that. And 30 years on, Lev Ivanov, the man who signed the case closed, gave an interview admitting he had been ordered to shut it down, apologized to the families, and confessed that he personally had never stopped believing the spheres were connected. When the investigator does not believe his own file, the theories begin. Theory number 1, the oldest and, for 60 years, the most embattled, an avalanche. It has always had one giant thing going for it, nothing else so cleanly explains why 9 experts would knife their way out of a button tent. And it always had 4 giant things against it. The slope was too shallow, barely 20 degrees. The searchers saw no avalanche debris. The tent's own poles were still standing. And the footprints walked away in good order, under snow that supposedly just tried to kill them. For 6 decades that deadlock held. Then, in January 2021, 2 scientists, Johann Gaume, head of the Snow Avalanche Simulation Lab in Lausanne, and Alexander Puzrin of ETH Zurich, published a study in a Nature Portfolio journal that changed the argument. Their proposal, not the roaring wall of movie avalanches, but a slab avalanche, a compact plate of dense snow, maybe 5 meters across, releasing silently and briefly. The trigger, the flat platform the hikers had cut into the slope that afternoon, plus hours of katabatic winds quietly loading fresh snow above the tent while they slept. The detail that makes the study almost surreal: to model the injuries, the team borrowed crash test data from old General Motors cadaver experiments, and adapted snow simulation code developed for the movie Frozen. The result matched the autopsy table. A dense slab, falling onto people lying flat on a rigid bed of skis and gear, produces exactly that signature: crushed ribs and skulls, distributed pressure, no external wounds. The impossible injuries of the Ravine 4, reproduced in a laboratory model, 62 years later. And in the years since, expeditions to the pass have photographed exactly such slab releases on comparable slopes nearby. The mechanism is real, on that terrain, in those winds. So, case closed? Not quite. The slab explains the wounds and the panic exit brilliantly. What it explains less well is everything after: 9 people walking 1.5 kilometers into a forest, instead of digging out boots and coats from a tent that was, when found, still largely intact. The snow can tell you why they ran. It struggles to tell you why they never came back. Theory number 2 says the killer never touched them at all. Katabatic wind, cold, dense air pouring down a mountainside like water, capable of going from calm to hurricane force in minutes. A 2019 Swedish-Russian study argued a downslope windstorm made the exposed tent untenable: you either get off the slope or the slope buries or freezes you. It would explain the orderly, single-file retreat toward the tree-line, not panic, procedure. Trained hikers, doing the textbook thing, in conditions that then closed the door behind them. A stranger cousin of that theory points at sound. Wind flowing around a dome like Kholat Syakhl can shed vortices that generate infrasound, pressure waves below human hearing that, in lab settings, produce unease, nausea, and irrational dread. The hypothesis, popularized by American author Donnie Icar: the mountain itself, in the right wind, becomes a panic machine. It has never been proven on that slope, treated as an idea, not an answer. But it is the only theory on the list that even tries to explain pure, sourceless terror. Theory number 3 is the one the families themselves believed for decades: the military. Some weapon test, parachute mines, a failed rocket, something secret, caught 9 witnesses in the wrong wilderness. The evidence assembled over the years: the orange spheres, the radiation on the clothing, the area's quiet closure, the case file's abrupt, ordered ending. Fragments of metal that hikers have hauled out of those valleys for years, a region littered with rocket debris from later decades. It is the theory with the most atmosphere. It is also the one with the least physics. Because each piece dissolves under a hard look. The radiation has a mundane, deeply Soviet explanation. Yuri Krivonischenko worked at the Mayak plutonium complex and had taken part in the cleanup of the 1957 KYSHTYM nuclear disaster, one of the worst accidents in history, hidden by the state for 30 years. Contaminated work clothing, worn on a ski trip, answers the detector. The famous sphere sightings came on February the 17th and in late March, during the search, weeks after the 9 were already dead. And no launch, from any range, is documented for the night of February the 1st. One mystery, dissolving into a different Soviet secret. And the wild shelf, clearly labeled, there is no evidence for any of it. The Mansi were investigated in 1959 and cleared within days, no tracks, no motive, and they were the ones guiding the searchers. Escaped convicts, the camps reported no one missing, and nothing was stolen from a tent full of money and alcohol. The Yeti, fueled by a blurry frame from the group's own film and by their own joke newsletter, remains what it always was, a joke that outlived the people who made it. If someone tells you they know it was any of these, they are selling something. In 2019, 60 years on, the Russian state finally reopened a review of the case, and in 2020 delivered its official verdict. A slab avalanche drove them out, and in wind and darkness, with visibility down to 16 meters, they could not find their way back to the tent, and froze. The families called it a whitewash. The scientists called it broadly right. And the 2021 Nature Journal study gave that skeleton its physics. Put together, the most probable timeline of the Dyatlov Pass incident now reads like this. Night, February the 1st. A slab of wind-packed snow releases onto the tent, injuring 3 or 4 of the 9 where they lie. Convinced the whole slope is coming down, they cut their way out, grab who they can, and do the correct thing, get off the slope, down to the tree line. The fire at the Cedar fails. They split, some building the den in the ravine, the strongest 3 trying to fight back uphill for the boots and coats that mean survival. The wind erases the tent from view. The cold does the rest, one by one. Every physical trace fits that story. Almost. Because a few stones still will not fit in the jar. The fire under the cedar died surrounded by a forest of deadwood, while 2 men climbed a tree instead of feeding it. The 3 on the slope were found in a calm, spaced line, not a struggle. Even the famous undressing has a clinical name, paradoxical undressing, the hypothermic brain flooding with false heat, science answers even that one. But the calm of it all, hour after hour of discipline and method from people the theory says were running for their lives, that texture, no simulation has ever reproduced. And Zolotaryov's blank notebook answers nothing at all. The place itself now carries their name, on the maps, forever, Dyatlov Pass. Hikers reach it every year, in summer over the stones, in winter on skis along the same rivers. There is a memorial plaque on the outcrop above the slope. The mountain looks exactly as it does in the group's last photographs, low, bare, patient. It is not dramatic. That is somehow the worst part. 9 graves stand together at the Mykolovsko Cemetery in Ekaterinburg, under one long granite memorial with 9 young faces. In 2013, a 10th was added. Yuri Yudin, the man whose back pain turned him around at the last settlement, had spent 54 years as the keeper of his friend's memory. He asked to be buried with them. He once said that if he could ask God a single question, it would be this: what really happened to my friends that night? Here is where the evidence ends. 9 of the best-trained young mountaineers in the Urals cut their way out of a sound tent and walked into lethal cold, and science, 67 years later, can now tell you, with real confidence, what pushed them out, what broke their bones, and what killed them. What it still cannot tell you is what those 9 people believed was happening, what they said to each other in the dark, in the wind, at the fire, in the den, through hours of calm, organized, doomed effort. The file called it a compelling force. The file was more honest than it knew. So, your verdict. Theory 1, the snow, the slab, the physics of 2021. Theory 2, the wind, the whiteout, the panic machine. Theory 3, the sky, the version the families never let go. Or something else entirely, hiding in the 1 hour the diaries cannot describe. 1, 2, or 3, tell me in the comments. Subscribe before you go, because every story on this channel ends the same way, where the trail stops, and the questions start. At the last coordinate.